All systems go. Clear for liftoff.
What's going on, golf fans? It's your boy GS Luke here with our round 3 showdown stream for the Tour Championship. Gonna get you guys ready for all of your lineups tomorrow with a look at the weather, some strategy for Saturday. We'll go through shots gained metrics, building a player pool, and we'll even build a lineup to tie it all together to give you a real good blueprint of how to attack tomorrow's slate. But sorry, we're going to late a little bit later than previously anticipated. We had a maintenance worker doing the absolute God's work in my apartment here, getting the AC fixed before the weekend. So shout out to that guy for working a little bit overtime to do that so that I don't have to be in the heat for the next few days. And we're rocking and rolling here heading into the weekend. We got Steven in the chat who says, yeah, we've got 19 hours to lock. Going to be pretty good to go from the time perspective. We got C Foyt down there as well. Says, hey, Luke, let's go. Yeah, let's get after it. It's been a fantastic week so far, a solid showdown slate, and we've made over 20 units of profit on the prop and betting side now. It was an epic round on with 9 units, but today I made 10.5 units on that side. So I don't know if I've had that good of a start to a golf tournament ever. So let's keep it going for DFS for the next few days. But let's start it off with a look at this golf course, which played even easier than round number 1, which had a lot to do with the rain they got yesterday afternoon. They got 1.3 inches of rain at East Lake. And if you thought it was soft, poop soft on Thursday, then today was even more so the case. And if we split it by the first versus second half, there was about a 0.3 shot difference towards the morning guys. So perhaps the slightly more receptive conditions did make things a little bit easier there, but it was only a 0.3 shot difference. And there's only 30 players in the field, which means that you're talking about a shot or two difference towards that side of things, which could have easily came down to variance with only 15 players on either side. So I'm personally not playing a big weather edge, especially with tomorrow's weather forecast looking relatively flat with the wind. You can see for Saturday on the HRRR that it doesn't have above 7 miles an hour wind all but 1 hour here in the afternoon. And your wind gusts aren't really that significant either. And this little bit of a storm that could come through in the afternoon would more than likely have to halt play if it was a thunderstorm. So I'm really not even worried about that little bit of a sell. I've got the play being pretty flat between the first and the second half. And the other thing to consider is that though the morning was 0.3 shots easier, we talked about the small sample size stuff. Now we've got the best players teeing off last. You guys that are in form over the first 36 holes. I know they regrouped after the first 18, but now that we have 2 full rounds under our belts, we really know who's playing well this specific week. So I think that it's probably going to look pretty flat when we compare the first and the second half. And the weather, probably not a big factor. But just for completion's sake, we are going to go through a few of the other ones on here. So the NEM forecast has a little bit more rain. But like I said before, any sort of thunderstorm is going to halt play. So I think it's hard to predict whether that's really going to impact play much at all. And they're calling for only a sprinkle at different portions throughout the day. So nothing too impactful there. Meteo Blue model, let's take a look at that one. Also a few sporadic storms, but nothing more than maybe 1/100th or 2/100th of an inch of rain, which is a mist at the very most. You have the Icon model here, same thing, more of a misting throughout the day. So scoring conditions, to kind of go back to that, I could see them getting a little bit harder if they have to play through this rain, but it's not really going to favor one side or the other. Like the GFS is probably my second favorite model out of all of these. Number 1, HRRR, second GFS, just based on accuracy over the last few years. And GFS has the most rain out of all of them. So if it is more of a steady stream of rain like we have here, that would make a pretty big difference on scoring, in my opinion. But this model, I mean, they're starting later, by the way. They're starting at about noon tomorrow, which I think might be a mistake. I don't really understand why they're starting later than the first few days when you've got afternoon storms in the forecast. But if they're starting about noon, that means everyone's playing in the same kind of conditions. So that's why I don't think tee times are at least a big part of my process. If you've got 150 lineups, if you have more than 20 that you're entering and you want to go with a couple and stack one side or the other just in case, I'm not completely against that sort of thing. And I guess maybe you'd want to stack like the very late guys, hope that there's a delay and they can get back after it on a softer golf course after that storm comes through. You could even make the argument that maybe the morning wave gets slightly more receptive conditions again and, maybe stack that side of it. But there's nothing that's definitive intuitive in my opinion. So it's much more about building a solid player pool, which we'll do with the shots gained metrics. We'll talk about a few of the other things you can incorporate to find your plays and to play the game theory side of things, which is arguably the most important part of these showdown slates, which is why we focus on it just after the weather. Weather can be massive. It's not always a big part of our process, though. But this ownership angle, the top 10 highest owned players in GPPs, is always going to be relevant. So that's what we have up here is the top 10 highest owned players in my projections. These are the ones that I have posted on my site. But you can see if you look at the DK price tab over here, it's all across the board. I mean, we got Scotty at 40%. That's pretty much a no-brainer. But you've got 9K guys, 10K guys, 6, 7K players that are showing up in this top 10. And that's because of the spread out pricing. So for example, a Goddard, he might not be minus 10, minus 13 like some of these other players, but because he's minus 7, he's got some of the best form of anyone down low. He's going to be over 20% owned, which for a lot of showdown slates would be blasphemous, right? We never see guys in the 6K range that are over 20%, but it's a much different week than usual here. So don't sleep on guys like him, even a Shane Lowry. I have getting a little bit of extra steam. Your 7K players like a McIntyre, a Ben Griffin, a Cam Young at $7,600. I mean, he's minus 11. You probably could have guessed that he was going to get some attention for tomorrow, but don't sleep on guys like Griffin, McIntyre. It's not, I guess McIntyre, you may have been able to guess at minus 10, but Ben Griffin, guys that are just playing a little bit better than average are also going to be pretty juiced up with the ownership down low. So these are some players that you might want to keep an eye on, at least from the ownership angle. Doesn't mean that you have to fade all 10 of these players. I think that would be pretty silly, to be honest. A lot of these players here are some of the best players on the slate for round 3 showdown. It's just that if you're going to use them, you're going to have to compensate for it at some point in your lineup. So outside of Scotty, worth noting that Tommy Fleetwood's 30%. My projection, same thing with a Russell Henley. And everyone pictured here, you've got to worry about just a little bit, but it's the rest of the ownership that counts as well. And you guys know I do run my own site. I do have to keep some of this blacked out because of that, because I do have paying members that I give these entire sheets to. But this should give you guys a pretty good sense for where a lot of the field is going, especially in some of the more high leverage plays, some of the more higher owned plays that we have on this kind of slate. So what you want to do ideally in large field GPPs, and we're going to kind of hammer this home later when we build a lineup together, is we want to play against the rest of the field, right? Ideally, we want players that are low owned. You can still have a high owned player or two mixing into lineups, but for 2 or 3, maybe even 4 players out of a set of 6 on DraftKings, you want guys that are average to below average ownership so that when they hit, you're not sharing them with 30% of the field. And, while it would be great for one of these top 3 players to get there, and, one of them very well could. In fact, I'm assuming that Scotty's going to get there tomorrow. I think he's got a vengeance. He's got a revenge on his mind after having one of his worst rounds in recent memory today. But like one of these 3 players you could still easily use. It's just that they come with the opportunity cost of being players that the rest of the field are going to be really high on. Let's go to the shots gained metrics now. So this will be how we actually build our player pool. And before you even reserve your contest, this is something that we don't always mention on these live streams, but you should consider building your player pool before you reserve your contest. Because if you know who you want to play, that can kind of guide where you want to put your exposure. If you see yourself on a lot of chalk, then maybe stick to cash lineups or some single entries where you're not going to have as high a chance to duplicate yourself. Whereas if you build your player pool and you have a lot of low-owned diamonds in the rough that you want to get to for round 3, then maybe consider playing in the large field GPPs, because as I was just mentioning before, large field GPPs, the big contest, you have to play against the rest of the field. If you've got a player pool set up ahead of time that looks really good for those kind of contests, then maybe you should side your exposure that way. That's oftentimes what I do when I go through my exposure. I think most people do it in the opposite direction, right? They reserve their contests and then they figure out who they're going to actually use. But I think that your process for building players really should not be dictated by what you're going out there and playing. It rather should be done in the opposite direction. So consider that, build your player pool first, and then figure out what contest to enter, which is kind of what we do here in the live stream, right? We always go through the shots gained metrics, any player pool deep dives that you have for me in the chat, all of that kind of stuff ahead of time. And then we figure out where we're going to go with our exposure afterwards, because at least to me, it's more logical. And I think it's something that you might find some value in doing yourself. Let's go through these round 2 stats. So we've got ball striking first on the list. That is always where we kind of turn our attention to first. And that's because these categories are the most translatable from round to round. So a Goddard was over 3 strokes into the positive in ball striking. That's off the tee plus approach. a Cam Young, 2.7 strokes, a Patrick Cantlay over 2.7 strokes himself as well. You also had players like a Ben Griffin, a Fleetwood, a Harris English, over 2 strokes between those 2 vital categories. So a lot of these players are in my player pool for tomorrow. I will say that not every single player that's highlighted here towards the top is in my player pool, because as you can see, they're all in the top 7 as well. That kind of ball striking is why they've played so well over the first few days. And like we were saying on the previous tab with the ownership, the players that are getting the most steam are, in general, the guys towards the top end of the board. So like guys like a Ben Griffin, you saw that he's like the chalk in the 6K range, but even your 10K options like a Fleetwood, a Cantlay are getting a little bit of extra steam compared to their counterparts, not only because of their leaderboard position, but also because of how they're getting the job done, because everyone kind of knows about the ball striking stuff here. You're not going to be the only one that's playing that sort of narrative. So we should continue down this list a little bit further to maybe try and find some of these fringe guys that maybe weren't elite with the ball striking today, but were still pretty solid, as they're not going to get as much attention as some of the guys a little bit further up. So like, for example, Harris English, a Keegan Bradley that are towards the middle end of the leaderboard in this 30-player field. They hit the ball well today. Like English, we already talked about the 2 strokes, but 1.5 for Keegan Bradley. Like that's the sort of player that you'll see me getting behind for Showdown tomorrow. A Matt McNeely, a Rory McIlroy, even a Russell Henley. And, you know, this is getting into the fringe territory here, especially with like a Henley who's only gaining about like 0.27 strokes per round in those 2 categories. But like these guys gaining over a half a stroke, like especially like your McNeelys, your Keegans here, and that 1 to 1.5 shots gained range, these players are going to get nearly as much attention as the guys that were starting in the top 10. And, you know, McNeely had himself a round today. He had one of the better rounds out of the entire field, but he started out so poorly that even after that sort of performance, he's only sitting at T20. So while he's going to be higher owned for round 3 showdown than what he was for round 2 showdown, he was among the 5 lowest owned players that we had on the slate. Tomorrow, he's not going to be one of the highest owned players either, right? Because he's only sitting there at T20. So, you know, if you're paying attention to these shots gained metrics, really diving into the weeds on not only who played well, but how they were able to get the job done, then that can be extremely valuable for your process. I also like to go through the short game stats to figure out who got a little bit lucky. Shane Lowry, I mean, it worked to my advantage big time. He lost like 2 strokes putting yesterday. And the reason why I'm not super thrilled about guys that gained a whole bunch of strokes with this putting category is that you can't rely on it in back-to-back days. Like a Sepp Straka, for example, he had, I think, either the worst or the second worst putting performance in all of round 1. What did he do today? Oh, gained about 2.5 strokes. Same thing with Lowry. I don't think he was as bad on the greens, but he lost like 2 strokes on the greens for Thursday. Comes out and is the number 1 player for the very next day. So while it was great for me to play guys like Lowry, Sepp, a lot of these guys I used in my lineups and I kind of looked out on today, hence why I had a pretty solid showing with my lineups. But I'm not counting on them doing it in back-to-back days. In fact, these sort of players I'm actively fading and trying to avoid in a lot of cases out there for my round 3 lineups. So these guys got a little bit lucky. You can also extend that to guys like a Fleetwood, a Corey Connors, a Bridgman, a Goddard. It's not a death sentence to see them gaining strokes in the field over here, but if they carried themselves and were only really gaining strokes in the around the green or the putting, then that's a bit of a red flag to me. So like, for example, I guess there's not that many that were horrendous with the ball striking towards the top here, but like a Sun GM, right? He lost ball striking, but gained a little bit short game. Like that's a 3.5, maybe even a 4 out of 10 stat profile. It's really not that great. A Corey Connors, he lost strokes ball striking and gained 1.5 putting. Like that's not the best stat profile. Except Straka, right? He lost ball striking and gained over 3 strokes short game. You can say the same thing about Lowry. He also was about a neutral with the ball striking and gained almost 4 strokes in the short game categories. Those are players that I'm grading out as well below a 5 out of 10. So you're not going to see me on a lot of those players unless they're super low owned. There's always exceptions, by the way, which we're going to talk about afterwards, because these shots gain metrics aren't the end all be all. We also want to consider looking at some other things on top of that to round out our player pool. So like you could still conceivably get to some of these guys that aren't grading out well, but put it this way, the shots gained profile is not why you're playing some of these guys that were gaining a whole bunch of strokes putting. It might be the course history that still gets you there. It might be them being a high upside player, good Bermuda grass putter, a bunch of different reasons, right? You could still get to some of these guys, but it's not this aspect or this piece of the puzzle that is really highlighting them for you. I also like to look at the around the green poppers. So like a Harry Hall getting 2.5 strokes there. Russell Henley, Keegan Bradley that gained over a stroke in that category. It's not like that's a death sentence either. And you can see it's a little less extreme, right? Not as many guys that were gaining over 2 strokes to the field with the around the green category. But still, if they were lackluster elsewhere, like a Harry Hall was, losing off the tee only gaining a little bit on the approach play, then it's a little bit more concerning. So that's how I take a look at those poppers and maybe kind of hold it against them in some cases. And then with the other side of it, so the guys that lost a whole bunch of strokes, it can be looked at in the opposite light, whereas it's super lucky to gain a whole bunch of strokes to the field. That's why I played Shane Lowry today. Lowry was okay ball striking. He wasn't great, but he also wasn't terrible. But when you looked at the short game categories, he lost like 3.5 strokes between them. And it was like, okay, if he's even a neutral, that's a big turnaround, let alone if he gains the 3.5 strokes like he did for today. Then he's like the absolute nutted play on the slate. So guys like a Colin Morikawa, who gained ever so slightly ball striking, but lost nearly 3.5 strokes short game, are the sort of players that you'll see me using for a bounce back. In fact, Colin Morikawa is in my player pool. Ben Griffin, the same thing, solid ball striking stats, but lost short game. And you have to be a little nitpicky about it, right? It's not just a good thing that they lost stroke short game. You have to marry it up with some decent shots gained stats elsewhere. So, for example, a JJ Spawn wouldn't necessarily be a short game regression candidate, right? Because he lost over 2 strokes ball striking today, and he was dog shit with the short game. Now, there's always the or he could. There's always some of the other things that we're about to mention that you could use to get to players that could still conceivably get you to the JJ Spawns of the world. But again, it's not the stat profile that should be getting you there to these sort of players. So we'll extend this to a Harris English. He would be a decent short game regression candidate, lost over a stroke and a half putting, but was pretty decent ball striking. Same thing with a Russell Henley. He gained ball striking ever so slightly. We mentioned before about a quarter of a stroke between those two, but he did lose putting, so conceivably could be a little bit better for round 3. That's how I use those categories to my advantage. And we could peek at the around the green guys as well. So like, for example, I know Hovland wasn't good ball striking. He lost about a stroke between those two, but he lost 3 strokes short game. Same thing with Brian Harman. Like, it does not feel like that's going to happen back-to-back days for those players that often. So you could conceivably use those guys for bounce backs. And what's great about some of these players as well, the ball striking poppers, a lot of them have ownership behind it. I know we mentioned that. The short game candidates, though, it's kind of the opposite. They're not really going to be nearly as highly owned because in a lot of cases, they're towards the middle to the bottom end of the leaderboard. So these are some spots that you can get some leverage on. And then to go back to my spreadsheet, because I do want to bring this up. And by the way, if you guys have any players that we haven't gone through yet that you want me to deep dive, feel free to let me know now, and I will go through those for you. But on top of the shots gained metrics, I use a lot of other things to get to players, because if you only focus on what happened for today's round, then you're not looking at nearly enough data. And in fact, you're way too short-sighted. If you're only looking at today's data, it's only 18 holes for all of these players. I mean, we've got hundreds of rounds from this year, but I like looking at the last 24 rounds for a lot of these players. And I like looking at some of these other categories like high birdie percentage. I like looking at their course history as well, how they've played at Eastlake over the years, to try and round out my player pool and kind of like the short game regression candidates. And by the way, these are my 4 player pool tags. It's what I use to get to all my different plays. I show this to you to show you that I'm very intentional about who I get to, right? And I think that it's also something that you guys can translate into your process and find a lot of value in, is be very intentional about why you're getting the players, and don't only make them things with the shots gained metrics. Add on top of it, for me, it's 50-50, right? 50% shots gained metrics, 50% stuff outside of what even happened today that I'm using to get to my player pool. That's what works for me. I've been tinkering with it. I add categories when needed. Like sometimes there's a wind category on top of it. Sunday Showdown, when we have placement points, I add placement point tags on top of it as well. The idea being, though, is that you have an idea for why you're getting to your players, and it's not just the last 18 holes that you're using for it. So consider that as a little bit more of a well-rounded way to build your process. And now let's build a lineup and go ahead and tie this all together. So in terms of building lineups for round 3, it's almost the exact same as round 2 Showdown. We really just have to make sure that we're getting enough leverage into our lineups, which for single entries is, I don't know, pretty typical, I would say. I don't think you have to really leave salary on the table if you're in like 100 or 200 entry single entry. But if you're in the large field GPPs, just like we talked about for round 2 Showdown and for main slate, you've got to leave salary on the table and get differentiation in there if you want a chance of not having duplicates. And with my round 2 Showdown exposure, by leaving at least $300 on the table in all my lineups, I was also pretty different with my player pool. I took a lot of, your Shane Lowry's, the guys that kind of sucked in round 1 like a Straka and ran them back and hoped that they would have a bounce back, and a lot of them did for me. I went with that low end approach and left some salary on the table. And I didn't run the exact numbers, but from what I could tell, I was over half my lineups were unique. So a decent portion of them were probably duplicated, but over half of them ended up being unique lineups. So maybe I need to extend it to like $400 or even $500 that I'm leaving on the table, just because ideally I'd like that closer to 75% plus. I have to run the numbers. Maybe I was close to 75% plus in terms of unique rate. And if that is the case, then I could probably leave it at the same sort of number. But leaving salary on the table in those large field GPPs is extremely valuable on a week like this. And I'm not talking about just leaving like $100 or $200. And here's the reason why I don't just talk about like leaving $100 or $200, because this slate, no one has the same price. I don't know if you guys noticed this. You may not have if you're not running projections like I am, but everyone has a different price tag here, which means sometimes we have like 8 to 10 guys at the same price on DraftKings for a main slate, which means leaving money on the table actually means something, right? It's not just going down to the next best option. This kind of slate, leaving $200 on the table, is just going down to the second next best guy. And because there's not a whole bunch of guys at that same exact price tag, it doesn't mean nearly the same thing to just leave $200 on the table. So I think that's why if I run the numbers, my dupe percentage might be a little bit worse than what it was for main slate, is because it wasn't as stringent with leaving that salary on the table. And based on those results, I do have to do a little bit of that lineup study here in a little bit. I may have to be a little bit more stringent about that. So let's show you what that looks like for the large field GPPs. So I'm going to start it off with a somewhat chalky player in Rory McIlroy. Second man in, I'm going to throw in a Patrick Cantlay as well. Both of those guys are getting some ownership, but they're grading out well with a lot of the different metrics that I'm looking at. For our third man in is where I'm going to start to kind of think about the ownership. I'm going to try and not be as chalky in this range. So I'm kind of tempted to go with JT just because after a slightly lackluster round, I don't think he's going to be as popular as some of the other guys around him. Let's go with I was going to say Harris English, but I guess he's not mega chalky at $7,200. But even the guys like an English that might be slightly overlooked, they're still going to be like 15 to 20% owned. So we're not really getting as much differentiation in there as we might think on a lot of different slates. Let's throw in a McNeely, right? His shots gained metrics looked pretty good. And now we're left with $6,800 for our last spot. And this is what I mean here, guys, right? Like if you leave $200 on the table, it's not like we're going past 7 guys, right? That you're skipping to get to like, I don't know, Shane Lowry, where you're leaving $300 on the table. You're only skipping like 2 or 3 guys to get to that sort of price tag. So that's why I might be a little bit more aggressive about leaving that salary, especially if you're in the large field GPPs. If you're in single entries, a couple $100 might even be enough in terms of leaving salary on the table. But when you have 5,000 to 10,000 other entries to play against, that's where I'd be considering going down to like an IM, maybe even a Goddard at $6,200. And maybe we would use Goddard as the last man in on this sort of lineup. Goddard is chalky, right? You could see he was like 25%, but I would feel better about taking a chalky Goddard as my last man in and leaving $600 on the table than spending all my salary and taking a Corey Connors here at $6,800. That's going to be a little bit lower owned. And that's just because everyone likes to spend their salary. If you take a look at maybe this week, it's a little bit different than most, but for most main slates, it's like 99.7% of lineups use within $300 of the max. It's going to be different this week because of the way that they have the salary, but a lot of that trend still ranges true, right? For the next round, most people are going to choose to take, somebody at like 68, 67, maybe $6,600 and not have the stones to go the whole way down to a Goddard at $6,200 that gets you that extra differentiation. So that's what I'm thinking about for round 3 showdown, guys. Hopefully it gives you guys a good plan of attack for tomorrow's action. I hope you see a lot of your names towards the top end of those leaderboards. Hopefully we can take down a lot of those contests, maybe even a few GPPs in the process too. For all the content that I'm doing, you guys can find that on my Patreon page, on my X/Twitter, that is GSLukeDFS. You can find that in my bio. And of course for the prop and betting stream, which I told you guys yesterday, I tried to warn you to stop by the prop and betting stream. We had the +9 unit day, a +10 unit day today. Don't miss it for round 3, guys. If you play on Underdog, you play on Prize Picks. Even if you don't, you can still enter a lot of those on the sports books like DraftKings and FanDuel, round score, round birdies, all of that kind of stuff. Make sure to stop on my live stream a little bit later on tonight. That'll be at 7 p.m. Eastern time on my YouTube channel. It's GSLukeDFS. GSLukeDFS, sorry about that. Going through all the conditions, pin locations, weather. We're really going to deep dive how the course is going to play tomorrow, as well as all the props on Underdog and Prize Picks and sports books on the matchups. Sportsbook matchups. So like 2 balls, 3 balls for the different sites out there. We'll talk PGA mostly. That'll be like 95% of it over there, but also some DP World Tour and live stuff mixing in as well. But that's all I've got, guys. I appreciate your support in the channel as usual. Best of luck, and let's have ourselves a moving day.